In World of Warcraft's 7th expansion, Battle for Azeroth, it would arrive with a whole new plethora of mounts for collectors to farm. In this video, we're going to go over the hardest to obtain mounts from BFA. This list is determined by what is currently the hardest to farm, however, and can still be obtained through playing through BFA's content. So that means mounts like the Mighty Caravan Brutosaur / Longboy will not be making this list. BFA also added a lot of mounts of similar nature, so entries on this list may tie in with each other. To start off this list at number 10, we have the G.M.O.D mount, added in patch 8.1 for the Battle of Allseer raid. This mount would drop from the High Tinker Mechatork encounter upon defeating him in a low drop chance. It can be farmed in all modes with the exception of its boss drop changing upon LFR difficulty. If you were to run the instance on LFR, Mechatork would not drop the mount, but instead Jaina Proudmoore, one of the rare and only instances of a rare drop chance completely changing its source based on difficulty. Now, what adds to the rarity of this item outside of just a low drop rate is in order to farm it, should you need help from others, you must all be on the same faction. Battle of Allseer was a raid with a unique flavor of faction war taking place as you progress through it. It made it where your character's faction would change to the opposite side depending on the bosses in your current faction of the time. This means if you wanted to farm Mechatork, you must be all Horde or all Alliance. Some may also think the Jaina mount of the Glacial Tidestorm is rarer than G.M.O.D, and in terms of effective farming, they'd be right. However, during BFA's runtime, a skip was added for every single player that would take you directly to Jaina Proudmoore in Mythic difficulty. Jaina also had a cheese strat where you would simply not kick her cast that would start the next phase and completely negate any difficulty in farming it with just 1 to 2 people. Because of this skip, many people have forgotten about Mechatork, and if you needed help on a character to farm him, groups are incredibly scarce. After all, according to data for Azeroth, over a triple of players have the Jaina mount compared to G.M.O.D, earning it a spot above the Glacial Tidestorm. And at number 9 on this list, we have Mollie from the world boss Dune-Gorger Krolusk added in patch 8.3. At the end of BFA's lifecycle, one of the world bosses since release received an update and now wielded a chance of a new mount upon killing it. The drop rate of Mollie wasn't too terrible in comparison to its various world boss counterparts, such as the Shaw of Anger, but held a more unique tag of a 6-week rotation. During BFA, every week upon reset, the current world boss would be removed and rotate to the next set of 6. This means if you had just missed Dune-Gorger, you would then have to wait another 6 weeks for him to reappear and be eligible just at an attempt of getting the mount. Dune-Gorger is also a level 50 world boss, meaning you can't always throw the forgotten BFA alt character at it and hope for the best, but typically only a few levels higher could do the job. Depending on your RNG, you could be stuck in this world boss for months, if not years, but with a relatively forgiving drop rate, the most waiting you'll be doing is on the rotation. For number 8, we have the Obsidian Krolusk mount, added at the beginning of BFA as a reward for the Dungeon Meta achievement. Since Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard has added a Meta achievement to each expansion that requires you to complete every boss on its highest difficulty in a special way, with the exception of Mythic Plus. BFA was no different to this edition and came with the Obsidian Krolusk mount. Generally, these mounts require multiple players in order to complete, and the Obsidian Krolusk follows this rule in some scenarios. So already the ease of soloing and obtaining the mount within a few days or less is gone, and you're required to find someone else in search of the same achievement as yourself. BFA came with 10 new dungeons, excluding the Mega Dungeon, so you need to journey into each one on Mythic difficulty and complete all 27 achievements. These achievements can range from things as simple as not getting hit by the boss's mechanics, as seen in Ready for Raiding 6, or be as difficult to manage as requiring a profession level to 75 of almost every profession, as seen in Losing My Profession. For number 7 on this list, we have the Island Expedition mounts. In BFA, players would be rewarded with the Heart of Azeroth from Magni Bronzebeard, a necklace artifact that would scale infinitely upward in power. The necklace could be upgraded in power by grinding a type of item in BFA content called Azerite Power. This Azerite Power could also be farmed from Island Expeditions, a new game mode where players would embark on a random island in Azeroth and slay enemies and harvest Azerite for their faction, empowering their necklace at an unlimited amount. These island expeditions had many difficulties, ranging from normal to mythic and even PvP versions where you'd face off against enemy players to see who could collect the total Azerite needed the quickest. Now, every week there was a predetermined 3 islands you could set out for, and these islands would rotate with the weeks. The islands always had a native race upon them that determined what would 100% spawn the island and guaranteed potential loot from them. Loot in islands was strange in the fact that in order to get certain items, the island would need to have certain creatures on it to make you eligible at just a chance for their loot. For example, if you wanted to farm for the Squawks mount, the island would need to have pirates on it for you to potentially loot Squawks. Sometimes certain items could only spawn on certain islands, and even if they were in rotation, they could happen to be not the native creature. As you progressed the islands, though, more creatures showed up. ranging from Mogu, Vicroll, Necromancers, all with completely different loot tables from each other. Players could spend upwards of hundreds to thousands of attempts at the same island just for the chance that their creature type would appear. Thankfully, however, in patch 8.3, Blizzard would allow you to exchange Seafarer's doubloons, a currency obtained from completing any island expedition, for chests, with loot pertaining to creatures from islands. These chests also had their own rotation completely separate from the islands themselves, but should the chest you want have the creatures you need, and with a good chunk of doubloons saved, you could obtain the items you sought rather quickly. So thankfully, with a little bit of RNG and lots of grinding, you could complete the grind in a few weeks or more for the one item that's been eluding you. And at number 6, we have all of the Mythic end boss dungeon mounts. For this entry, all of the mounts share a remarkably low drop rate and require a full clear of the dungeon in order to obtain them, creating lengthy runs and many sunken attempts. The only semi-exception to this rule is the Mechagon Peacekeeper, as it drops from HK8 Aerial Oppression unit, but when the Mecha Dungeon was split into 2 separate versions, HK would become the end boss of its own version. There would be a total of 4 Mythic rare drop mounts: the Underrot Crawg from the Underrot, the Tombstalker from King's Rest, Sharkbait from Freehold, and the Mechagon Peacekeeper from Operation Mechagon. Because these mounts could only drop from Mythic difficulty, this meant that each character could only get 1 attempt on the 4 mounts a week instead of the daily attempts from Heroic difficulty. Fortunately for these mounts, they were still eligible to drop from Mythic Plus, making spamming low keys a very commonly seen phenomenon within the community. Some players have reported hundreds to nearly thousands of attempts on this bundle of mounts. And we would even see the scenario repeat itself in Shadowlands for the Marrowfang mount from the Necrotic Wake dungeon. Ultimately, the time-gating process of farming these mounts and the requirements of many alt characters to attempt at the already low drop chance earns it a spot on this list, just above the previous entries due to there being 4. And at number 5 on this list, we have another tie of mounts: the Junkheap Drifter, Rusty Mechanocrawler, and the Silent Glider. All of these mounts were added in patch 8.2, Rise of Azshara. Obtaining these mounts was rather simple in farming, but could leave you stuck for months, if not for years for some. See, in patch 8.2, Blizzard added 2 new zones, Mechagon and Ashtatar. Both of these zones came with them a large plethora of new rares, and some of these rares would drop a mount upon killing them, if you were lucky. Soundless for the Silent Glider, Rust Feather for the Junkheap Drifter, and the Arachnoid Harvester for the Rusty Mechanocrawler. These rares, like most, could only yield loot for you once a day, making the farm a daily effort for collectors. Aside from the already incredibly low drop rate of these mounts, the spawn timer on the rares themselves was incredibly long for the average rare NPC, with some reports as long as 2 to 8 hours long. Players have reported up to hundreds of kills and maybe seen 1 to 3 players looted from them. What makes this especially difficult to grind out is during BFA, many players would non-stop be waiting in the new zones for these rares to spawn, and could realm hop to more effectively farm them with their characters daily. With BFA no longer being the current expansion, these zones have been relatively abandoned by players, other than the occasional player continuing to farm these mounts, making realm hopping no longer an effective strategy. Sometimes, however, since the zones are left behind for so long, the rares could have spawned and been up for upwards to hours on servers with low player counts, making many players use alts all across Blizzard servers. Thankfully, there are many discords that announce when these rares are up in their server and will ping users in the discord to let them know when to find it and join their group for an attempt, but the numbers of these groups are still relatively slim. And at number 4, we have the Snapback Scuttler mount, added in patch 8.2. This mount was added as a meta achievement for completing a large variety of achievements within the new zone's content, Ny'alotha. Already, the task you've been asked is mountainous in size, and has left players on half-year-long grinds for the crap. In order to receive this mount, you would need to kill every rare in Ny'alotha, locate every arcane chest and glowing arcane trunk, shoo away 100 bloodfin tadpoles, find 100 treasures using a grindstone, complete the Summon from the Depths scenario 10 times, explore all of Ny'alotha, complete 30 different bounty or requisition daily quests, find all the lost crystal and cat figures spread across Ny'alotha, and even more than could become a guide video on its own. Alone, just one part of the meta, Aqua Team Murder Force, is a 2 to 3 month long grind in getting your followers to Exalted with you. Fortunately for players, this achievement is just incredibly grindy and relatively forgiving in its term of RNG, and can be completed if you really set yourself out for it compared to the other meta achievements. In addition to your new crab mount, not only does it have a diverse look in how it moves sideways, but you will also receive the title of the Deeps upon completion, making the achievement's grind more worth it to some. And at number 3, we have the Mechacycle Model W, otherwise known as the Mecha Done achievement added in patch 8.2. Following the release of Rise of Azshara, its sister zone, Mechagon, would also be released and come with it a massive amount of new content for players to dive into. This content could originate from crafting your own mounts and special on-use items to your own create trinkets and toys. Every mob in the island was able to drop these crafting materials, and Mechagon was scattered with treasures for players to hunt down. With over 37 new crafting recipes for everyone to get their hands on and 32 new weeklies, players were eager to get their hands on the new zone's content. In a newer fashion, this zone received its own meta achievement as well as, despite not being the main zone of the new patch at the time, and allowed players to grind for 2 large rewards at the same time. With the Mecha Done achievement, you would receive the more polished and golden version of the new wheel mount added in 8.2, only one of 3 in the game at the time of the script. However, this meta achievement has the Nazjatar meta beat only slightly, not just for the fact less people have this mount compared to the crab, but it is horribly RNG, and could leave players stuck for what feels like an eternity. Almost all of the achievements in the meta require either the correct weekly to appear for you, or an item with a drop rate as low as a 0.5%. It is actually easier to farm the mount from Rust Feather than it is to farm certain vinyls, an item necessary for the meta. Truthfully, if RNG was on your side, you could complete this achievement in a matter of weeks, or you could be thrown into a years-long grind. Thankfully, the achievements are account-wide and can be farmed across multiple characters in an attempt to try to cut the process down as much as possible. And at number 2, we have the Conqueror Scythemaw, added at the launch of Battle for Azeroth for completing the new meta achievement for War Mode. With the release of BFA, Blizzard would implement a new system to the game that would allow players to toggle world PvP at any time they wish, so as long as they were in their faction's capital city. With this, the original PvP servers with PvP toggled constantly were disabled, but it allowed players who did not play on these servers to experience world PvP and its wonders at any point if they so desired to. When enabling War Mode, you would then be flagged as unfriendly to anyone of the opposite faction, making you killable by even max levels as you journey the new expansion. As compensation for turning on War Mode, your character would then receive a % buff to their experience and currency rewards gained depending on how much of your faction was currently using War Mode. The higher the buff, the less players were using War Mode on your faction. With War Mode came new world PvP options, with examples such as war supply crates falling with goodies, and players could brawl over the chest loot, and whoever came out victorious would claim the items within. If a player of your opposite faction reached 10 kills without dying, they would receive a buff that increased their damage but also marks them on the map for everyone to see and grants them the assassin status. If you could manage to kill this player, you could then loot their body and receive extra honor and various other rewards. For the Conqueror's Scythemaw, it would culminate in all of these systems together into a large meta achievement that requires you to participate in world PvP in the BFA zones for both Horde and Alliance. These achievements would often ask you to obtain 1000 honor in every zone, kill assassins, and loot war supply crates. Sometimes these things must also be done in groups of 2 to 5 players. During BFA's runtime, this achievement was more than doable, especially during content drops throughout the expansion, as the patches would incentivize you to visit the zones and players would want to receive the max amount of loot as possible. What makes this achievement so difficult as of Dragonflight is these zones have been mostly abandoned by players, other than the occasional leveler or collector heading into farm dungeons. The grind to obtain 1000 honor during current was already costly, but with maybe only a few players an hour, the task can become greatly extended. This especially shows when the meta achievement asks players to kill at least 10 assassins and loot their bounties. With the inclusion of this achievement, this makes it almost completely required for a group of friends to aid you in getting the mount for your collection, as without it, you may never see an assassin in the zone you're currently farming, if ever. The general strategy would be to ask your friend to let you kill their character over and over and farm the honor it gives, and when you reach assassin status, they kill you instead and loot your corpse. Not only all that, but the Band of Brothers achievement portion of the meta already asks you to be in a group of 2 to 5 players, meaning no matter what, without help from another person, this achievement will never be completed by a solo player. There is some leeway in farming this solo, however, if you're willing to drop extra money on multiple accounts and park the characters' locations where you can farm them repeatedly. You can also join epic battlegrounds, and upon entering, you will see an NPC with a quest text such as Victory in Wintergrass, and can be turned into with any zone, rewarding you with a chunk of honor, and the game will associate the honor with the zone you're currently in, earning you credit towards the Tour of Duty achievements for the meta. Upon completion of the achievement, not only will you receive the Conqueror Scythemaw, but the Conqueror of Azeroth title for your character. And finally, at number 1, we have the Ny'alotha Allseer mount from Ny'alotha, the Sleeping City, added in patch 8.3. For the final patch of BFA, we would receive the Visions of N'Zoth. This patch was set where we would battle against the old gods of the deeps, N'Zoth, and journey into his new raid and face against not just him, but his unholy creatures of horror. The general theme of this patch was corruption and resistance temptations. To do this, the player character set into a journey by Wrathion, one of the last remaining black dragons, to create a new legendary cloak that will help combat these maddening whispers. This cloak was completely necessary for finishing the new raid, Ny'alotha, as without it, on the final 2 bosses, your character would instantly go mad and be mind controlled, thus making you either die quickly to the rest of your raid with the cloaks, or be killed by the boss himself. It wasn't quite like the attunements of old from classic WoW TBC, but in order to truly finish the raid, you were forced into obtaining this special item from Wrathion. So, this prerequisite alone adds extra difficulty in even just entering the raid for an attempt at the Allseer mount. The questline wasn't account-wide either, and for every character you wish to run through the raid, you would need to repeat the questline in full. At current levels, the quest chain typically can take the casual player 1 to 2 hours at most. Once you venture into the raid itself, however, it must be set to Mythic mode only, as it is the only difficulty that yields the mount. At the current time of this script in patch 10.1.7, the bosses of this raid are able to be killed with a geared group of 2 to 3 players, but almost none can be soloed, adding further difficulty to the farm. Not only will you require a geared group of players, but in order to obtain the skip, you cannot bank off of another player's skip route. Since Warlords of Draenor, raid skips have been introduced into WoW, where if you cleared the raid enough times, you'd be given the option to jump to the last 2 bosses of raid after killing the first boss. Ny'alotha followed this procedure, but rather than killing the penultimate boss around 4 times, you were required to kill 3 different bosses of 3 different sections of the raid 4 separate times. So, already, you're forced into a 4-week grind of every encounter in the raid should you not loot the Allseer in your first few attempts. With the skip in mind, cloak equipped, and you've reached Ny'alotha himself to get your mount attempt, there are still mechanics to watch out for, despite BFA ending almost 3 years ago. Ny'alotha's special cloak came with the Insanity mechanic, where you could only temporarily resist the whispers of the old god, and by failing mechanics, could cause your sanity to drop down. Should your sanity reach 0, your character would go mad and you'd be mind controlled instantly, resulting in your character basically being dead. Ny'alotha has many sanity draining mechanics that could affect even the most geared level 70 character, and puts players into a position where a legacy boss requires legitimate coordination and effort to down. Your only safeguard from losing sanity is doing mechanics correctly, and a single on-use button unique to the fight that restores sanity to yourself and those around you. This button has a 20-minute cooldown, so it reiterates failure is permanent in this encounter. It's possible to duel the boss if you have lust and are careful enough, but it's considered legitimately impossible to solo currently. The reason for this is Ny'alotha will send you to a down phase section of this fight, and you cannot do this mechanic more than once per fight, making it where 2 people are necessary. There has been an instance where Ny'alotha was soloed, however, due to a bug with mages. When you complete the down phase of the fight, Ny'alotha is stunned and vulnerable to damage, and a certain mage managed to use a bug relating to Touch of the Magi, and brings Ny'alotha to a secret phase by lowering his health to 24%. This alone shows the amount of health Ny'alotha possesses, even 2 expansions after his defeat, and how impossible it can be attempted alone without the use of exploits. Even after you achieve all of these victories and defeat the encounter, your chance of receiving the mount is still extremely low, like most Mythic raid mounts. Players can spend hours alone preparing to storm the raid, but the last 2 bosses might not even be defeated, wasting lockouts and stinking the community into hundreds of attempts for the Allseer. This is only a quick summary of the fight, its general themes and strategies, and I highly recommend looking up guides and coordinating with the groups on how to defeat this boss for your special squid. Hopefully in the future, Blizzard can revisit this raid and remake how the sanity mechanic works, and allow players to be able to solo the boss to make the grind much simpler. Alright, and that's all of them. There were many more mounts I didn't go over on this list, and many of them received tied places with other entries just to show how similar they were of obtaining. Just one Mythic dungeon mount getting its own spot when there are multiples of the same existing felt unfair, and there's no true way to distinguish their rarity. Was there any you think are harder to obtain than was on this list? If so, let us know down in the comments below.